Substantiate, to establish by proof or competent evidence. Welcome back to Substantiate. I'm the host, William Glasser, bringing you hypothetical sports matchups every single week. Before we get into this week's episode, I want to give you a couple updates about the podcast. Number one, I recently got an invite to the app Clubhouse. It is an iPhone only, as of now, social media app. It is audio only, and I'm thinking about maybe hosting a room maybe once a week and talking with some listeners just about some sports going on. There you can follow me at William Glasser. That is just me, not the podcast. And I have 2 invites to give away, so this week I'm going to try to figure out the best way to give away those invites, and then next week I will let you know how you can enter. And then also, of course, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at substantiatepod. Again, that is at substantiatepod. And you can listen to every episode of Substantiate on www.substantiatepod.com or on any podcast app. Some of the episodes from season 1, I've had some people re-listening to them, and they're truly great episodes. Some highlights were quarterback wide receiver duos playing in a 2v2 basketball tournament with Pat Ivane. That was a great episode. Anyway, yeah, like I said before, you can check them out on our website and in your favorite podcast app. Next week, I will be coming back to you with my picks and predictions for the Super Bowl, and we'll preview that game against the Buccaneers and the Kansas City Chiefs. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and definitely tell a friend about this that you think they might enjoy it. If everyone told one friend and just got one person to listen, then our audience would double. Now, if you got 2 people, then our audience would triple. Just think about that. So definitely tell someone about this. Much appreciated from my end. I put a lot of work into this, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Today, I am joined by Michael Casagrande. How are you today, Michael?
I'm doing just fine. Just keeping busy.
It seems like we all are right now. If you had to throw a bottle into the ocean just with a message that someone's going to read, say 30 years from now, it shows up on a shore, what is that message going to say?
It's kind of funny that you mentioned that, because actually I did just that a few months ago when we were down at a girlfriend's parents' beach house in Florida. Actually got a empty champagne bottle, wrote a note, and threw it into the ocean. So it's kind of funny. Just said that it was we're in the middle of trying times in this country right now with a lot of political unrest and a pandemic, and I hope this note meets a happier destination once it surfaces on a beach somewhere. So it's kind of funny that was only maybe October that we did that. So I guess I have a real world answer for that since I actually did it.
Yeah, I was not anticipating that at all, but yeah, that's great. Just a bit of a moment of reflection. So coming into Alabama, the football team, and this team has been good for decades. And most recently, their last 6 national championships were 2009, 11, 12, 15, 17, and then just now in 2020/2021. So what have they been able to do to build sustainable success? Because that's something that's different from pro sports to college sports with recruiting versus drafting players and signing players.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I've covered the team. My first year covering the team was 2009, so I've been here. I was away for a year. I covered the Miami Hurricanes for a year, but I've been here for every championship they've won. So I think it's their ability to adapt to the changing landscape of college football. That when I first got here, they were winning championships mainly on defense. They'd run the ball. They were more of a old-fashioned style team, you might say. And I think they've been able to sustain the success recently by updating the way they played football, the way they played offense, the way they recruited, to bring in a more of the modern style player. That 7-8 years ago, the Texas A&Ms, the Ole Miss, Auburns were giving them trouble with these fast-paced offenses, and they were kind of playing a little bit more older style of football. So they recognized that and adapted to it. And, you can see the offenses that they run today are, nothing like they would have run 10, 11 years ago.
Yeah, and head coach Nick Saban, what year was he hired?
2007.
Oh, okay. So he's been at Alabama throughout that entire process, and I imagine it's him more specifically that's been able to really be the cause of change throughout the locker room and keeping them up to date. And I alluded to a little bit before with recruiting and transferring compared to drafting and signing players in college versus pro sports. So what is Alabama's recruiting department like, and how are they able to bring in these 5-star recruits and get some transfers?
Yeah, well, it's a pretty well-oiled machine, what they've got with their recruiting operation. It kind of, the personnel might come and go, and there's a decent amount of turnover with that. But it's a system they have set up pretty well. It's well stocked with a lot of different people. Not everybody can go out on the road, and at this point, nobody can go on the road for the recruiting process. Only certain people can actually contact the recruits, but they've got a pretty well-oiled operation behind the scenes who are identifying prospects, who are breaking down film, who are setting the letters, sending the mail, the email, all the different tools of communication that you have to do, that you need to have in this age in recruiting. So, the assistant coaches, they've kind of come and gone. It's more turnover than most programs probably, but they've been able to sustain that success. Saban's been still at the top of that pyramid no matter what. But it takes a lot of work to establish those relationships, and especially when coaches are not necessarily there for as long as maybe in certain places or in the past.
Yeah, when you have a lot of change like that, but still a constant head coach, it really shows how Nick Saban has been the one that has really brought a lot of that change on. So now, if we just look at the schedule throughout this season, the differences in the scores between them, because they went 13-0, including the playoffs, compared to whoever they were playing on that certain week. In all of college football, it's just such a large gap between their opponents. And the closest game in the regular season was against Florida, when they only won by just 6 points. But then even in the playoffs, they're able to beat Notre Dame and Ohio State by such a large amount. And with a game that's leaning more and more offensively, how has Alabama been able to keep their opponents' scores so low?
Yeah, well, I mean, the defense definitely improved as the season went along. If you go back to the third or fourth week when they played Ole Miss, they gave up a program record yardage, 640 plus yards. And so they weren't always defensively as sharp as they had been maybe towards the end of the season. And if it wasn't for the offense that they have, they might have been in more trouble. They could bail out the defense in some of those situations. But I mean, it's just kind of one of those years where I think some of the teams they faced that normally had a more potent offense, in Auburn, for example, LSU from a year ago, were obviously some of the better offenses in the country, and they were pretty far down this year. So they benefited from playing some teams that weren't as sharp offensively.
Yeah, when I just look at this schedule in the regular season, the only ranked opponents they played were Georgia, who was ranked number 3 at the time, Texas A&M 13, Auburn 22, and then Florida 7. So, like, they weren't necessarily playing ranked opponents every week, but they played some ones that were really high up there. And does that just allude to how the SEC was this year, or always is, or it kind of just having a big gap between the higher teams and lower teams?
I mean, I guess it depends on how you look at it, a few different ways. But I mean, the times that they were playing, I mean, Georgia was up there at 3 at the time. A&M wasn't ranked as high at the time when they played, but their ranking improved throughout the season. Didn't lose after they got beat by Alabama. So, yeah, I mean, the SEC was a little bit off. I think all of college football is a little bit off this year with the way the teams, rosters were always fluctuating. You weren't sure week to week. Some teams, you could play a team 1 week, it's a totally different team than you would have a week after that with the way the rosters were. So I think it was just a really difficult year for some programs, and some programs handled it better than others. And, it's kind of, I've been telling people if your team wasn't that good this year, it's a bonus if your team was good this year. If it wasn't, like, I wouldn't read a whole lot into, certain things, because the circumstances were so different from program to program. And so, yeah, it was just weird. It was just a weird year. And, Alabama was obviously much better than a lot of the teams they played. But yeah, I think there were just more factors than normal, more data points than normal going into the season.
Yeah, and you mentioned that they had one game postponed against LSU back in the middle of November, which was then rescheduled for a few weeks later when they wound up winning 55-17. and all of these different, again, like you said, all of these different things going into this year, which truly makes this championship stand out for the good and the bad. All right. So then when we look later into the season when they played Auburn, LSU, Arkansas, and Florida, what was a bit of, or what were people thinking really going into those games? So, for example, if they lost to Florida, who was ranked number 7 at the time, then, how was this going with all of the rankings and who's making the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, if they would have got beat by Florida, I still think they probably would have made the top 4. It would have made Florida's case, make a case for Florida to also make that playoff. But I think they were pretty safely within that top 4 at that point in the season. There was enough, debate about a Notre Dame, or the way Notre Dame lost to Clemson in that ACC championship, or the Ohio State. You could have made a debate about them being in or out if Alabama would have lost that game. But there wasn't a big impression that if Alabama, unless they would have been completely blown out of the game and looked terrible against Florida, it's going to be tough to keep them out of the playoff at that point.
And this was their first championship, I think, in quite a few years now that they didn't play Clemson at all in the playoffs or the regular season. They played Notre Dame and then Ohio State after that. So with 2 ACC teams coming into this at number 2 and number 4, but Alabama, they didn't have to play Clemson. And with all the questions coming in about Ohio State and only playing just a few games because of the Big Ten's policies this year and delayed decision making, what was it a bit of an awakening for Ohio State to beat Clemson?
Yeah, I mean, Ohio State was a good team. You could tell they didn't have a big, a long season, and they obviously struggled in certain games against Indiana. They weren't very strong against Northwestern, but they were a team that was hit as hard as anybody with the virus. They had games canceled. They had a lot of star players out. Olave, their best receiver, was out for that Northwestern game. So they were it was tough for them to really fully get a full team on the field at a certain point in the season. So you knew, and they had pretty much everybody there for that Clemson game. So everything kind of came together. They were pretty fired up over what happened a year before that in the playoff when they lost to Clemson in the Fiesta Bowl semifinal. One of the better playoff semifinal games of this era. And so there was a lot going for them going into that game, the way the disrespect they had received from Clemson from Dabo Swinney. So I think they were pretty motivated going into that game. And they played as well as they've played all year, as well as anybody's played in the game. They were just, from what we saw of it, they really blew out Clemson, a team that had lost a game, but that were without Trevor Lawrence on the road at Notre Dame. So it's all these kind of weird things of the season coming together in Clemson, Ohio State. And then it didn't look like Ohio State with the full strength
Justin Fields.
Lawrence. Justin Fields was not a full strength in that game against Alabama. Couldn't run, didn't have the same ability to run as he normally would. So it was, all those combination of factors coming together in Miami Gardens that night.
Yeah, and then they ultimately won 52-24. So they definitely put Ohio State in their place, and that just shows how much better they were than Clemson this year. And if they had played Clemson this year, how that would have been a really interesting game to see how Clemson fans would have reacted if Alabama had just utterly crushed them like they crushed Ohio State. And with such a strong offense and Trevor Lawrence, it just really a crazy, or that would have been a crazy game compared to some of the past years. So now coming on into some individual players, obviously there is Devontae Smith, who is most likely going to be the first wide receiver to go in the draft this year. He won the Heisman. He had 23 touchdowns all year. That's almost 2 per game. What would Alabama have done without these star players really breaking out this year?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I'm not really sure. Devontae Smith had been a good player for the first 3 years he was here. Obviously, caught the touchdown pass to win the championship as a freshman. He was always a strong, solid player. He had, I think, he led the team in touchdowns as a junior in 2019. So he's had a big time. His whole career has been very solid, steady player. They've got some depth. The receiver, maybe not as much depth. They had some younger guys who were out there but didn't play quite as much. They didn't have to play. So I guess it's kind of one of those things where it's hard to say how, without the Devontae Smith and Najee Harris, how they would have played, because they really didn't do much without them. But I guess they'll find out next year will be maybe the best answer, because all those star players will be gone from this team that just won the championship. Mac Jones going to the NFL, Devontae Smith, Najee Harris, 2 or 3 linemen going pro. So a lot of their star players on offense will be gone, and you'll see how they can, what life would be like without those guys, those stars.
In Alabama, over the last few years, they've had several different quarterbacks all going to the NFL, Tua and some others. But Mac Jones, he didn't really play much last year. He was a he was a junior this year, and he's going to the draft now. He led all of college football with 4,500 passing yards and 40. He was second with 41 touchdowns. So, is Mac Jones coming back next year, or who's going to be the quarterback next year?
Yeah, no, he's going to the NFL. Mac Jones is. So Bryce Young is the next up. He's a 5-star freshman. This past year was number 1 or 2 or 3. I can't remember exactly, depending on which recruiting service. He was one of the top recruits overall in the country coming in to Alabama this past year from Southern California. So he's the star in waiting, and he got a little bit of experience at the end of some of the games this year. But the fact that they played the all SEC schedule meant they didn't have some of the games against the the smaller opponents where the backups, the freshmen, would have got a lot more experience and playing time. So, but he still seems to be the guy who they'll be looking to. I mean, there really isn't anyone else behind him that would be a real challenge for the job. There's a true freshman coming in this signing class, and there's a junior to be Paul Tyson, who's been on the team for past 2 years, but not really threatened to be a starter. So it's pretty solid Bryce Young's team moving forward.
And when you talk about changes in coaches, assistant coaches, and as well as players in college, no one's really playing more than 4 years, and in Alabama having to circle through many quarterbacks just because they've gone pro. And how has the rest of the offense over the last couple years just evolved to changing quarterbacks?
I think they're mostly trying to keep a consistency within the style of offense as opposed to who the quarterback is. It's not, there's some adaptation to who, there are certain, Tua was more of a runner, had more of ability to take off and run, and they call running plays for him as opposed to Mac Jones. But I think the basic concept of the offense for trying to remain somewhat consistent, whether who was the quarterback, they aren't going to, if Mac Jones went down, Bryce Young came in, they weren't going to run a completely different style of offense. They were going to still run the same offense, no matter who was the quarterback. So I think it's more around the offensive philosophies than necessarily who's the exact person under center.
Yeah, and then over in the running game with Najee Harris, he complimented Mac Jones pretty well. He's a senior also, another one just going to be cleaning out through the offense. And what's the running back position going to look like next year? And how much has Najee Harris done over the last couple years?
Yeah, no, Najee Harris was a great running back the last few years. Definitely this year and the year before that, his junior and his senior years are probably definitely his breakout years. He was a number one recruit coming in as well. Huge expectations. Didn't play as much early on in his career. Just a lot of guys ahead of him. Damian Harris, Josh Jacobs. I think it was some frustration for him early on in his time here that he wasn't playing as much as maybe he thought he would be, but it was a matter of waiting your turn, getting better behind the scenes, and he really broke out the last few years, especially showed his value in the passing game, his ability to catch coming out of the backfield, not just the traditional dump down, swing passes. He even lined up this past year in the SEC championship game as a slot receiver and caught a touchdown pass. So he's shown his versatility, and that's something that's huge for the NFL. And they want to see, being able to do more than just take the handoff and run. He's good in pass protection. But yeah, next year moving forward, Brian Robinson's a guy who would be coming back conceivably for a final season. A local Tuscaloosa kid who is a solid number two behind Najee Harris this year. But where he was in some of the previous years, they've been more balanced. The top back, and then maybe a second back was getting more time. And Brian Robinson didn't get maybe it wasn't as much of a 1A, 1B situation. You have guys like Jason McClellan, who's coming back, who was a freshman this past year, who showed, he was a guy who would come in late in games. He showed some good pop, some good speed. You have Trey Sanders coming back. He had the hip injury in the car accident during the bye week that ended his season. Another guy who was the number one overall running back 2 years ago, who had a broken foot in his freshman season. So there is a lot of talent. There's a lot of talent coming back at running back, mixed amount of experience, but it'll be interesting to see how they work all those guys in.
Yeah, definitely. And that's an important thing in college football, to be able to rotate them in and have many targets. So should one go down, then someone else can step up. And if we flip to the other side of the ball on the defense, There were some star players like Christian Harris and Dylan Moses. And, in an evolving college football game that's becoming more and more offensive, them being able to stop their opponents more than other teams have this year. It may not seem like a lot, but, they still were compared to other teams. And with all their stats and stuff, how have they been able to kind of keep their defense grounded and not say, okay, well, this game's an offensive game, so we're not important? Well, they are important, and they did a great job this year.
Yeah, I mean they've evolved in that sense too. You have guys like Christian Harris was a defensive back in high school, and now he's a middle linebacker at Alabama. It's the progression towards, with more athletic offenses, more spread out offenses. You want to have guys who are at a middle linebacker position who can go sideline to sideline, has the speed, has the ability to play in coverage, and not just be a thumper. You go back, several years, you would have a Dante Hightower, was a bigger middle linebacker, a real presence in the running game. Maybe not as much in the passing game. He was a big hitter, and just a bigger guy, as opposed to a Christian Harris who's not as heavy. Can still hit, can still fill the gaps, but he's going to be able to play sideline to sideline a little bit better in that sense, because you have more responsibilities, you have more field to cover now, and you can see that progression in some of the linebackers. The body types are different. They're not as big, and not by a huge amount, but like you can 10, 15 pounds can be a pretty big difference when it comes to the athleticism, the speed that you need to get to a corner, get to an edge, to chase down a running back or a quarterback or a receiver who's getting into the open field. So I think that's a big thing. Dylan Moses was an All-American style type player going into the season. He had the major knee injury before the 2019 season, and I don't think even he would say that he had the kind of season he was expecting to have. Wasn't that same dominant force that he had been in 2018. But he's gone pro, so he won't be back next year. And he was another one of those guys who was a 5-star recruit on the cover of ESPN magazine as an 8th grader, kind of blue chip phenom. So he'll be gone next season. But they've been able to do a good job of piling up number 1 recruiting classes to where there are guys behind them that can fill in and fill that gap moving forward.
Yeah. Again, their recruiting is really amazing to be able to keep it up for more than a decade at this point, and by the looks of it, it'll continue. And when you look at some of the stats with their defense, their opponent's passing completion percentage was 58.1% compared to their offense's 76.2%. So kind of comparing the best offense versus, or one of the best offenses versus their defense, and their yards allowed on average holding their opponents to 239 yards and just 1.2 touchdowns. And that's how you win a football game right there. When,
right.
Just all of the things that go into outscoring your opponent. And really across the board, they played well this year.
They certainly did.
Again, we kind of touched upon some things looking at next year. And so now on the defensive side of the ball, what could next year bring for Alabama?
Yeah, they're going to be they're replacing some obviously some key players. Patrick Surtain, cornerback, was their only returning starter, a full-time starter in the secondary. And that was kind of a weakness going into the season, and just a lack of experience. And I think now that they'll have, they'll be obviously losing him, but they'll have guys, Jordan Battle, Malachi Moore, Josh Jobe, guys who really cut their teeth as starters this year, that will be able to return next year and have the experience that they were lacking entering this year. You'll have guys like Will Anderson, National Freshman of the Year on the outside linebacker, who could be the next big star at that position that they had kind of been lacking in recent years. A good edge pass rusher who can make a big difference in the opponent's passing game, and he was definitely in there. A lot of quarterback hurries, and that's not the sacks aren't always the big thing. Sometimes it's the ability to force to rush a quarterback into making a pass before he's ready to throw it. Can be a big factor, and he's going to be a star for at least the next 2 years, you would think, with the way he came out of the gate as a true freshman, and not even the highest. He wasn't a 5-star guy, he wasn't a 2-star guy or a 3-star. He was a 4-star, but he wasn't the guy that you would have necessarily on paper said this is going to be the breakout freshman as a first year player. So I think they have the ability to reload with some of these guys. Defensive line, they'll have some more experience coming back. Maybe not as dominant as some of the previous championship seasons, but I think looking at that roster, they're retaining most of those guys to come back for next year.
Yeah, that's a really important element to be able to bring guys back. And yeah, it looks like their defense could be on the up and up, and their offense next year definitely has a lot of potential, a lot to prove again. And is there anything else you wanted to say about the team this year, or before we sign off, or where can the listeners find you?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think most part there's the big picture look at it is there's going to be a lot to replace on offense. They're going to be, it's going to be next to impossible to replicate what they did this year with losing such a core of that offense. But I think defensively they could be a little bit better. There was a lot of discontent, I guess, among fans at certain points in the season with the way their defense played. But I think when it mattered most, they stood tall. I think that's the gist of it. And if people want, they can always find me on Twitter at by Casagrande, Casagrande. Pretty active on there. And AL.com was where they can read my work.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for coming on today and talking about Alabama with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you for listening to this episode of Substantiate. The best way to help support the show is to, number one, tell your friends about Substantiate. That is the number one way to support us. The second way is to leave us a 5-star review in Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. Number 3, follow us at substantiatepod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Hello, I'm Anthony.
And I'm Dr. Issues.
And we're hosts of Capes on the Couch, the podcast where comics get counseling.
Superheroes don't always get to go home happy. That's where we come in.
We offer psychiatric and mental health analysis of comic book characters.
So check us out at capesonthecouch.live and across all social media platforms at Capes on the Couch.